Thank you very much, Your Honor. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Very nice to appear before you again. This is the last time I get a chance to appear before you. Under the rules, Mr. Greer gets another argument after I'm done, but this is the last time I have to address you, so I would like to join in Mr. Greer in thanking you for agreeing to serve on the jury in this case. We recognize that it's a sacrifice, that you have a lot of things to do in your life. You're away from things that you generally like to do. It probably takes you away from your family, your jobs. We know you put a great deal of effort into it, and we're delighted that you agreed to serve as a juror on this case, because this case, my client is charged with the most serious, despicable acts you can imagine. I'm going to show you the lawsuit. You've heard Mr. Greer talk about that. His entire future and everything he's going to be depends on the verdict in this case. So the fact that you have taken this much time out of your schedule, so that once and for all, this is now 4.5 years, these charges by the Zahau family have been pending against Adam Shacknight. 4.5 years of utter hell as he encounters people in life that think he's a cold stone killer, a sexual pervert, to use Mr. Greer's allegations that he's been making for 4 years. And yes, we want a jury that once and for all, not based on what's in the press in the past or people's emotions or feelings, but just based on what you actually hear in the courtroom that truly qualifies as evidence. As the court told you, that this is the great equalizer here. This is where someone who files a lawsuit in this country, anyone can file a lawsuit. Anyone who wants to can walk into any courthouse in the country, this courthouse, and can file a lawsuit 4.5 years ago and make all kinds of despicable allegations against my client, allegedly engaged in murder. But there comes a time of reckoning when no longer are they allegations. They're no longer just theories. They're no longer just speculation. There has to actually be witnesses that come on the witness stand and testify to prove that my client actually committed murder and did all these acts. There have to be actual exhibits introduced to prove that. And that's what a trial is for, and that's the fact that you all have sat here for the past several weeks and done that. We're very grateful for that. My job this afternoon is I'm going to do the best I can. I'm going to try to pull the evidence together in some logical, hopefully understandable way. There's been a lot of evidence presented. I want you to understand in some detail. There has been a complete failure of proof in this case. Total failure to prove that my client did any of the acts they charged in this complaint. And I'm going to walk through that in some detail because there's a lot at stake here, and I want to take the time to spend it with you. I'm going to try to do it in the most logical fashion, the best I can do, and I'm going to take the time to do it because there's so much at stake. Now, I will tell you this, that the bottom line is that you've heard from Adam Shacknight already in this case. He testified. He went on the witness stand. You heard his testimony. Mr. Greer had an opportunity to cross-examine him about anything he wanted to. But Adam Shacknight took the witness stand and looked at each one of you and told you in detail, I did not do those acts. I was not in the main residence that night. I went to bed and I stayed in the guest house, and I never left. And he proceeded to make clear, under oath, before all of you, that he did not do that. And then under our rules, Mr. Greer gets a chance to cross-examine him on anything he wants to. I expected Mr. Greer would cross-examine my client on all the evidence that he had that proves that my client actually even went into the main residence and aggressively confronted Rebecca Zahau. He didn't confront my client with any evidence about that because he doesn't have any. I then expected maybe he would start cross-examining my client about all the evidence he has that my client then assaulted Rebecca Zahau and smashed her over the head 4 times with a blunt object and made her unconscious. I waited. He didn't cross-examine about any of that. because he didn't have any evidence of that to cross-examine Adam on. Then I thought, well, maybe he'll cross-examine him on all the evidence he has that summarizes, that proves that in fact Adam Shacknight then took his hands and choked Rebecca Zahau to death. And I waited to think, well, is he going to cross-examine him about that evidence? No, it didn't happen, because he didn't have that evidence. The next allegation I thought he might cross-examine on is his allegation that my client then put red rope and bound her body and then walked her out on the balcony and pushed her over the balcony railing. So I waited. Was he going to cross-examine Adam on any evidence that he had about that? I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And he didn't produce any evidence during the cross-examination to try to show you that my client was lying, that my client wasn't telling the truth when he said he didn't do it.
Mr. Webb, you need to slow down for the public.
And I apologize to you. I apologize to you. I'm going to slow down. Mr. Greer had a chance to attack the credibility of my client to show you that he's a liar. And he cross-examined for about an hour. And when Adam Shacknight left that witness stand, I don't think there was anything that Mr. Greer did that in any way showed you that my client was lying, that my client wasn't telling the truth when he denied all of the allegations in this case. Now, I talk about Adam Shacknight's testimony because he wanted to go on the stand, and he wanted to tell you his story. And he told you his life story. He told you everything about how he works and what he does, and I'll come back to that. But he wanted to be cross-examined. He wanted you to see that there is no such evidence. But remember, under the law that the court instructed you on this morning, Adam Shacknight does not have to prove anything in this case. The burden of proof, under the law, the court told you this morning, the burden of proof is always on the plaintiff. The plaintiff is the person that filed this lawsuit. The plaintiff has the burden of proof of establishing with credible and persuasive evidence that in fact they've proven their case under the preponderance of evidence standard that the court told you about. That's their burden. That burden never shifts. And if you find at the end of all the evidence that they've not sustained their burden of proof, then your verdict under the law is required to be in favor of Adam. Second point. You learned at the beginning of this trial, some of you came in here having read things about this case. Some of you said you actually had some preconceived thoughts about the case. And we accepted you as jurors because the court told you you have to set those aside. That in our courts, the most fundamental principle of justice that we have is that cases will be resolved by jurors only on the actual testimony and exhibits that are admitted into evidence during the trial. That under the law, you set aside all of your, if you heard something on TV that might have biased you, you set that aside. Wipe everything out of your mind and see if you can walk into a courtroom and just decide the case just only on the evidence you hear and nothing else. And if you had some preconceived thoughts about this case, forget about it, because that's not evidence. And I've watched you during the trial, and there's no doubt in my mind that you've all done that, and that we're going to get a fair verdict here based only on the evidence you heard during the course of the trial. And by the way, that makes our system of justice the best in the world. Because across America today, there are jurors just like you. In other cases, they come into cases, they got preconceived feelings and notions and biases. They have to get set aside, and jurors take it very seriously, and they only decide case based on the evidence, and that makes our system of justice strong, and it makes our jury system strong, and so I appreciate the fact that you've done that for us during the course of this trial. Now, I put up on the screen the actual allegations in this case. I want you to see them in stark black and white. Allegation 1. This is what the plaintiff has pled in this lawsuit. That Adam left the guest house. That he entered the main residence and aggressively confronted Rebecca Zahau. Number 2. She tried to flee. Adam struck her 4 times on the back of the head with a blunt object, rendering her unconscious. Adam then choked Rebecca Zahau to death. And then after he put a rope around her neck, Adam anchored the rope around the base of the bed, picked up Rebecca Zahau's body, and pushed her body over the railing. That's actually what the lawsuit says. That's what the plaintiff has to prove. Those are the specific acts that he must prove to you with credible and persuasive evidence in order to establish that he's proven his case. Right now, if you think about what evidence you've heard, I put here on what Mr. Greer did not acknowledge at all. In fact, he tried to conceal from you what I have on the screen now. There is no witness testimony from anyone. Not a single witness during the trial said they saw or heard Adam Shack and I do anything to harm or kill Rebecca Zahau. There's not a single witness that said that. Not one. There's no testimony from any law enforcement witness. None whatsoever that came into this courtroom and said that they had any evidence or any testimony that Adam Shack and I had done anything to harm or kill Rebecca Zahau. In fact, 4 different law enforcement officers who worked on this investigation came into this courtroom and swore under oath they did a thorough investigation, and the one thing they were certain of, there was no evidence that Adam Shack and I did anything to participate in the death of Rebecca Zahau. Number 3, there's not been any testimony from any expert witness that Adam Shack and I did anything to harm or kill Rebecca Zahau. And number 4, there's not even any documentary evidence. There's no text, memos, emails, nothing, photographs, nothing that shows Adam Shack and I had any connection to the death of Rebecca Zahau. And lastly, there's no scientific or forensic evidence that shows that Adam Shack and I had any connection at all to the death of Rebecca Zahau. Now let me stop there. You've learned a lot during the trial as you've been jurors in this case. There's basically 2 kinds of evidence that you receive. You get testimony from folks that take the witness stand, and they tell you things. That's evidence. Testimony is evidence. You get exhibits. You get exhibits that come in like photographs or emails or memos. They come into evidence. That's evidence. That's what you have to find that the plaintiff has sustained their burden of proof. I cannot name for you a single exhibit or a single witness that has testified that there's any evidence they have whatsoever. So I put on the screen right before you the total number of witnesses that testified in this case. There's 29. I tried to put them in the order they actually testified in. Some of them, most of them testified live. Some of them by videotape. Most of them live witnesses. And they're all in the order. So you've heard testimony from 29 witnesses. There's not a single one of those witnesses that provided you with any testimony whatsoever that Adam Shack and I did anything to harm Rebecca Zahau. In fact, when Mr. Greer when he was walking through his summary for you, normally when you give a closing argument, you say, well, I'm going to prove that John did X, and after they say it, they then summarize the evidence. This witness said that, this exhibit showed that, that's how you prove things. Mr. Greer did not do that. Mr. Greer just said, Adam Shack and I barged into the residence, he then confronted Rebecca Zahau, he hit her over the head 4 times, strangled her, bound her, and threw off the balcony. And I was like, wait a minute, where's the evidence? He's supposed to summarize for you the actual witness testimony or exhibits that he introduced into evidence that proves those things. That's what his job is. So those 4 things that I have on the screen, those are the things that he has to put witnesses on the stand or exhibits into evidence that proves that those 4 things actually happened. So when I get done talking, Mr. Greer gets another chance to talk with you. And Mr. Greer, I'm going to respectfully ask you right now, I want you to go through and summarize for this jury what witness on the list of 29 actually provided testimony that Adam Shack and I is connected to the death of Rebecca Zahau. because there's not a single witness that did that. There's not a single exhibit that did that. Now, Mr. Greer says, well, I may not have any evidence like that, but I got some circumstantial evidence. And I'm going to come back and talk about what he claims to be circumstantial evidence. But I'll tell you right now, right at the outset of my closing argument, when he talks about circumstantial evidence, it has nothing to do with Adam Shackman. He comes up with circumstantial evidence that he believes shows that Rebecca Zahau, that the police didn't get it right. That Rebecca Zahau didn't commit suicide, but somehow she met with some foul play. That's not evidence against Adam Shackman. That's not evidence at all against Adam Shackman. I'm asking, what is the actual evidence against Adam Shackman that he actually ever did those four things on this chart? And the answer is zero. Zero evidence. So, like if I were right now, if I were to put a pile on the floor here, and I pile up the evidence that supports Adam's position, and I put a pile over here that supports the plaintiff's case, it'd be like this. That's the truth. There's virtually, this is not a case where you say, well, there's a lot of evidence on this side, and then there's a lot of evidence on that side, and we're going to have to balance this out and decide, whether the plaintiff has sustained their burden of proof. That's not this case. We don't have that evidence in this case. We just don't. There's been a total and complete failure of proof during the course of this trial. Now, I talked about witnesses and exhibits. How about scientific evidence? Forensic evidence. We have that in this case because of the police investigation. And so the police investigation is important to us because they did enormous amounts of reliable, thoroughly done investigative work with forensic evidence. And I've summarized it on the screen here. I'm going to come back and talk about it in more detail because this is really important to Adam for you to understand. But I'll just quickly summarize. DNA. There's a huge volume of DNA evidence that Shelley Webster from the Sheriff's Crime Lab explained to you during the course of a day and a half of testimony. But the bottom line is, I put on the chart, the bottom line is that Rebecca Zahau's DNA was found on many objects, on all of the rope knots and items at her death scene. Her DNA is all over the place on virtually every significant piece of evidence. Adam Shacknai's DNA is nowhere at that scene. Nowhere whatsoever. And I'll come back and talk a little bit later. Mr. Greer said, well, maybe Adam doesn't shed DNA. That's not true. That's false, by the way. And his own witness, everybody sheds DNA. So I'm going to come back and talk about it later. But his witness and my witness said everybody sheds DNA. They may not shed it on a given day for some reason, but they shed DNA. But if they just took a shower, there may be a couple of hours where they wouldn't shed DNA. But everybody's a shedder DNA. So his defense that somehow Adam doesn't shed DNA. By the way, if he thought Adam didn't shed DNA, he should be doing some scientific test on Adam to prove that, bring it in here and show it to you. Because he didn't. Okay? So his own witness said everyone sheds DNA, and that's true. So the DNA evidence is extremely powerful that Adam Shacknai had nothing to do with the death of Rebecca Zahau. Same with fingerprint evidence. All of the fingerprint evidence, every speck of it, connects Rebecca Zahau to key pieces and objects in the area where she died, and not a single fingerprint for Adam Shacknai. Not one. Footprints. There's a very important footprint evidence in this case showing Rebecca Zahau and how she went out on the balcony and how she placed her feet and had weight on her feet and moved along and went over the balcony railing. That footprint evidence has been talked about it quite a bit. I'm going to come back and talk about it quite a bit more. But the bottom line is Adam Shacknai gave the police his shoes so they could check it out. His footprints are nowhere at the area where Rebecca Zahau died. And also, because of all this deviant sexual perversion they accuse Adam of, they did a rape kit. She was not, it came up negative. Dr. Lucas looked at, obviously, an autopsy in her vaginal area, no trauma whatsoever. So this idea that there's some great sexual assault case here is totally disproven by the scientific evidence. So, when you combine, it's just been a total failure of proof, and I intend to walk through it and go through it, particularly some of the scientific evidence in some detail. Now, as far as the allegations against Adam, Mr. Greer said something very interesting this morning that I want to make sure you focus on. Mr. Greer, the first witness in the case was Mary Zahow, and so I cross-examined her on whether or not, in pursuing this litigation, whether the Zahow family had made false allegations in court against people, alleging that they participated in the murder of Rebecca Zahow. And when I cross-examined her on it, and she admitted. This is on the screen. That's why Mr. Greer this morning knew he had to front this off and admit what happened. Here's the testimony of Mary Zahow during my cross-examination. Question: have you ever stated under oath in this case that Dina Shacknai actually encouraged Adam to commit acts of murder against Rebecca? Have you ever made that allegation? Mary Zahow's answer under oath was, we made allegation that it was Adam, Nina, or Dina that committed the murder of my sister. We didn't have any evidence at the time. The Sheriff's Department concluded the investigation as suicide. It didn't leave us any option but to start from scratch. Now, what Mr. Greer now told you is that that they filed a lawsuit back in November of 2013, and they alleged that Dina Shacknai, Nina Romano, and Adam all participated in a conspiracy to murder Rebecca Zahow. When they did that, they had no evidence of that. And she admitted in this courtroom. You can't do that. If everyone in the U.S. wanted to just go into court and just go ahead and say, I'm just going to...
relevance in this case.
Sustained.
Well, in any event, she acknowledged that she filed a lawsuit and that her family filed a lawsuit, and they had no evidence at all at the time that any of it was true. At all. Then Mr. Greer tells you today that and by the way, when Dina Shacknai, at that time, we can only imagine the pain and suffering she must have felt after having been losing her stuff.
Relevance.
Sustained.
Well, Dina Shacknai was accused of the same savage conduct that I just showed you Adam was alleged to. That was alleged against Dina Shacknai when they brought this lawsuit in November of 2013. Now, they then, Mr. Greer this morning told you, well, we did that, and but we then took Dina and Nina out of the lawsuit, and we left Adam in because we found out that Dina was at a hospital where Max was, and there were cameras. And so they let Dina out of the case, according to Mr. Greer, because they found that out. But Mr. Greer also told you this morning that actually that they actually learned that Dina was at the hospital on August 15, 2011, when Agent Detective Sweda filed a report in which she reported that Dina was at the hospital. So Mr. Greer and his client knew...
This states the evidence.
Sustained.
Well, at least Mr. Greer told you this morning that it was in Sweda's report. And they then filed the lawsuit. They filed this lawsuit a year and a half later on November 12, 2013, in which they alleged at that time that all this happened because of a conspiracy between Dina, Nina, and Adam. And then it wasn't until April of 2017 that they decided that they were going to let Dina out of the lawsuit. Apparently Nina...
There are lacks evidence, less.
Sustained. It's not part of the evidence in this case.
Mr. Greer told you this morning that they kept Adam in the case because they found out he was smart. They originally, he said, alleged that Dina was the mastermind behind the plan to murder Rebecca. That Dina was the mastermind. That's what they alleged. Then they told you this morning, Mr. Greer told you this morning, well, we actually let Dina out of the lawsuit and we kept Adam in because we decided that Adam was smart. To base a lawsuit and an accusation of murder against someone because Mr. Greer and his client decided that Adam Shacknai was smart, therefore he should be charged with murder, that's wrong. That's wrong. And they don't have any evidence. By the way, this trial could just as well be here today with 3 people on trial. Dina, Nina, and Adam.
Relevance.
Who was on that crime?
And all 3 would be on trial, none of which they would have any evidence. Which is what Mary Zahala did. They wouldn't have any evidence against anyone. Now only Adam. By the way, if there had just been a camera in the guest house where Adam was sleeping, then maybe he wouldn't be on trial. But he is. Because he's smart. And so he's left into the case for you all to decide what to do about a case where there is no evidence and someone is charged with murder. Another thing that happened this morning that Mr. Greer anticipated coming was the following. I want to talk to you about the clothes of Rebecca Zahal because it shows you how easy it is for someone to make a false allegation during the course of a sensational trial like this one. Let's go back to the start of this trial. In the opening statement of this trial, Mr. Greer maintained that the clothes Rebecca Zahal was last seen wearing on July 12th, as she dropped off her sister at the airport, was in this picture you see on the screen there. It's Exhibit 852. That Mr. Greer said that that's the clothes that Rebecca Zahal was wearing, and Mr. Greer went on to explain that Adam stole those clothes because he's some kind of sexual pervert that steals clothes when he murders people. So he stole them after he murdered her. That's their position. Mary Zahal went on the witness stand and testified that they looked so hard to find these clothes, and these clothes are, by gosh, missing in this case. And let's find out whether Adam stole the clothes. Well, Mr. Greer told you this morning that I put a picture up on that screen during this trial that showed Mr. Greer and Ms. Zahal that they had made false statements about this. Those clothes are not missing. Those clothes are in the closet of Jonah Shacknai's house. And I'll show you the evidence of it. This is Mr. Greer's statements, an opening statement that these clothes are missing, how Adam's a pervert, etc. Then Mary Zahal goes on the witness stand and she talks about how hard they looked to find these clothes, trying to set up the anticipation that they can continue to allege that Adam stole the clothes as part of his sexual perversion. So then we put on the witness stand the crime lab forensic evidence technician, Miss Williams, and I give her credit for this because she's the one that called this to our attention. She testified that she took photographs on the day Rebecca's body was discovered by the police on July 13. Miss Williams took a huge number of photographs all over Jonah Shacknai's residence to preserve evidence. by way of photographs. And she said at one point, she remembered she'd gone into the master bedroom where Jonah and Rebecca stayed and slept. And she went into it. She started taking pictures in a closet of things that were in the closet. And she then called to our attention that shirt right there, that shirt that Rebecca Zahau was wearing, her last known, the clothes that were stolen. She brought this photograph in and we put it on the stand during the trial, and there they are, the clothes. Obviously, Rebecca Zahau, on the night of July 12th, after she got back from dinner with Adam and Jonah, she took her clothes off, like other human beings do, and she left them in a pile of the floor of her closet. And so the next day, on the afternoon of July 13, when this photograph was taken by Miss Williams, technician Williams, she took a photograph. James can read, by the way, stay out here. If you stay out, you can see that. You'll see the shirt in the pile there, and the jacket's underneath it. It appears to be a bra that was taken off at the same time. James, can you go down on that a little bit more?
Can you just state for the record the exhibits that you're publishing?
I am. I'm publishing on the left Exhibit 852, 852, and on the right is Exhibit 1005.
Thank you.
And so on the when you zoom down on top of this, you can see it better where you see the sequined striped Rebecca Zahau shirt that she was wearing that day. You see underneath it her jacket. So the so-called missing clothes that Adam apparently stole when he murdered Rebecca for sexual perversion reasons, it's all not true. It's not true. They were on the floor of the closet in Joan Shacknai's house. Mr. Greer frequently this morning in his closing argument talked about theories that he had. And he said they changed their theories sometimes. But you know, sometimes lawyers try to make theories out to be evidence. And theories are not evidence. Evidence is actual testimony and exhibits. Mr. Greer and Ms. Zahau had a theory, that they then accused, made it into an accusation that Adam Shacknai stole those clothes as an act of sexual perversion. When in fact, the truth is, it's not true. And yet, you're going to see as I go through more of the details of the evidence, that throughout this case, they have changed their theory because since they don't have evidence, when they come across more additional information, they change the theory. And you're going to hear it several times as I go through my comments here today. I want to talk about Adam for a minute, because I guess it's a fair question that who is Adam Shacknai? You have a right to ask that question. That's why he went on the stand and you got a chance to know him. But it's, people, when they live their life, a person who actually, I think, that would get up in the middle of a night, barge into that residence, confront Rebecca Zahau, viciously beat her over the head 4 times with a blunt object, then eventually strangle her to death, bind her body, and throw her over a balcony. Those vicious, despicable acts, you might think that if someone had lived their whole life, maybe there'd be some telltale signs that Adam Shacknai is capable of anything like that. So I wanted you to get a chance to know Adam. He sat in this courtroom every day of the trial. He testified and put his credibility right on the line for you all to judge and make decisions about. And I think he came across, he went through all cross-examination by Mr. Greer, and when all the dust settled, Adam Shacknai is an honest and sincere person that could never have done those acts. Ever at all. And there's nothing about his life. It's not like we didn't describe it to you. We walked through Adam's life, probably in more detail than you wanted. But I thought there's so much at stake in this case. I want you to at least know that there's nothing in the man's background that would ever cause someone to think that he would ever get up and do these kind of despicable acts. And so I'm going to rely upon your memory. I don't want to go on and on, but Adam grew up in a small town in New York, very normal family, great mom and dad, and his older brother Jonah, they did the things that kids do, and Jonah kind of took care of him as the older brother. And it's a very stable, very wonderful, middle-class lifestyle that they grew up in. And Adam, life as a young adult, Adam, after he went to college for a couple of years, and then he decided he liked Memphis, Tennessee. And he told you why. He just loved the feel of that town. Adam has been in Memphis, Tennessee for 30 years. He's not a vagabond that just travels around the country and is unstable. He's been in Memphis, Tennessee as a stable, active member of the community in Memphis, Tennessee. And unlike Mr. Greer trying to tell you that he's some kind of loner, where's Mary? Are you here? Mary, that's Mary, okay?
No.
Mary, this woman that...
No evidence.
Sister Steve,
In any event, Adam testified that he and Mary have had a 20-year relationship, a very close, loving, caring relationship. They enjoy their life in Memphis together. They have friends. They enjoy all kinds of things in Memphis. And he told you all about it. Understand. But there's nothing about Adam's life in Memphis, Tennessee, other than somebody just enjoying being part of a community and being stable there. He owns his own home, and he's there. And by the way, his work career, he's worked for 28 years on the Mississippi River. And he likes it. He told you why he liked it. I said, same job, 28 years. He first was a deckhand, and then everyone liked him and thought he worked really hard, and they let him get promoted to a mate. And then they said, why don't you try to get a tugboat pilot license? You got to get it from the Coast Guard. Got to pass all these background checks. He did. He became a tugboat pilot. That was 20 years ago. And he's still a tugboat pilot today. Still working on the Mississippi River, and he likes the job. He loves the people, and he just enjoys it. And he does it. And by the way, though, he's got 4 different licenses. He's got these licenses where he actually can take a boat out on the ocean now. He's got an able-bodied seaman license. He's got 4 different licenses, and he has to renew them every 5 years, pass background checks, drug tests, everything in the world. Never has he had a problem about any stability in his work life, ever, ever, ever. Very stable, very ordinary life. Adam, he went back and got his college degree. He just wanted to get that college degree. He went back and got it in 2000, and he maintains very close family ties with the CACT3 family. They get together 3 or 4 times a year. And maybe lastly, I asked Adam, I said, have you ever had any trouble getting along with the law? He said, no. I said, ever? No. Any convictions? No. Arrest. He told you about 1 arrest. Years ago, he turned right on red, and a policeman stopped him, and then when they checked something, he had some kind of wrong insurance coverage. So they gave him, they charged him for not having the right insurance. The judge threw it out of court. That's the only time in his entire life that he's ever even been arrested for anything. And certainly no convictions, and no one has ever accused him of any violent acts whatsoever in his entire life. Yet that's the man they brought into this courtroom to tell you that he's guilty of these despicable acts of murder. And by the way, we talked about Dina Shacknai this morning. Mr. Greer brought it up because of the fact that they charged her with murder and then dismissed her. So Dina testified during our trial, and she had a couple statements about Adam and how he likes to follow boundaries. I'm going to play just a clip of the testimony that's in evidence. James, can you play that?
During that period of time, were you able to observe Adam Shacknight and Jonah Shacknight interacting with each other.
Yes.
Yeah. And what was your opinion as to what the nature of the relationship was? How'd they get along?
They got along relatively well. Adam was very easygoing, and they would sort of razz each other as brothers do. Adam had a very distinct sense of boundaries, so he was always respectful around the kids and us and the family. So I always observed them as, I never observed anything uncomfortable, untoward between them.
So another segment.
And just so that the record is clear, the theory that Adam killed Rebecca, you don't support that
I
theory?
don't believe Adam was responsible for the death of Rebecca's house.
Now, I put this simple chart up on the screen because I thought it's important that as I go through my closing argument to make sure that it's clear what the case is about and what are the issues on the verdict form that you're going to be called upon to decide. And as I've set forth in the chart, this case is exclusively about whether the plaintiff has proven that Adam Shacknight murdered Rebecca Zahau. Whether Rebecca Zahau committed suicide will not be on the verdict form and will not be a decision that you'll be called upon to make, because the charge in this case is whether they've actually proven evidence that Adam Shacknight is the one that murdered Rebecca Zahau. If, for example, some of you as jurors later said, well, I think somebody did it, that's fine. Maybe you want to say she didn't commit suicide. I'm going to talk through a lot of evidence that I would respectfully suggest overwhelmingly shows she committed suicide. But it's okay if you disagree with that, because that doesn't change the issue. You still will address the simple, straightforward issue as to whether the plaintiff has proven with credible and reliable evidence that they've met their burden of proof and that Adam Shacknight is the person who actually murdered Rebecca Zahau. Now, we called law enforcement personnel to the stand because the law enforcement people also were investigating. They were looking at Adam. Remember, Adam was the one that brought Rebecca down that day. And I'm going to come back and go through it in more detail. But Adam was a person of interest because he was there, he cut her down, and so they investigated Adam. They called this a suspicious death because of the way that it occurred. And they investigated it for 2 full months. But the reason I went into that was not because at the end of the day it matters whether Rebecca committed suicide or it's homicide. It's because the law enforcement people developed evidence that exonerated Adam Shacknight of having any involvement in her murder. And you're entitled to hear that because that is evidence, for example, the forensic evidence that helps prove that the Zahau family has not met its burden of proof, because there's overwhelming scientific evidence developed by the police. So I'm not saying the police are not important because they developed evidence and conclusions, but the issue of suicide is not the issue that you're addressing or will address on the verdict form in this case. Now, I sometimes think better when I put things into a timeline, so I'm going to go back now and try to summarize the key events and put them into a timeline. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on things that I think you pretty much already know, but just to kind of refresh you, I'm going to walk through the major events and emphasize things that are really important as far as facts that relate to issues that you're going to have to decide in this case. So let me start with the timeline of the deaths of Max Shacknight and the death of Rebecca Zahau, and that timeline of events, which, as you recall, took place in a 2-day period between July 11 and July 13 of 2011. And so here are the facts. I'm going to go through them quickly, but on July 11, Rebecca and Jonah had been in a romantic relationship for about 2 years. They were living together, and for the 2011 summer, they had come to Coronado. At 10 a.m. on July 11, Rebecca was in the house with her sister, that's Zena, and Jonah's 6-year-old son, Max. Jonah had gone to a nearby gym, and they were all going to meet up and go to the beach together. Around 10 o'clock in the morning, Rebecca heard a loud crash that turned out to be a chandelier that fell from the ceiling down. Max had been thrown off the railing, grabbed onto the chandelier. Max came crashing down, hit his head on the floor, and you've heard the tale. Rebecca immediately told Zena, get a hold of the police, call 911, and the first responders showed up very quickly at the CACT3 house, and at that point in time, Max had no pulse. And the first responders gave Max CPR. Jonah was contacted immediately. He came rushing home, and Jonah got into an ambulance, and they followed Max to the hospital. Unfortunately, Max, they could not get his pulse back for about 25 to 30 minutes, and eventually that was more than life could give him, and eventually he passes away. Actually, on but on that day, July 11, law enforcement authorities looked into Max's accident. They investigated what happened, and the law enforcement authorities, I think everyone agrees, correctly concluded that it was an accident. No one was at fault. No one blamed Rebecca. It was just an accident, a tragic, horrific accident, but no one blamed anyone for it. Max stayed in the hospital, and finally, on 5 days later, at the hospital, Max was pronounced dead. Adam was there at the hospital with Jonah. It was a very sad day in their life. But during that time, while Max was in the hospital, Rebecca was helpful. Rebecca helped Jonah with meeting people at airports. Friends were coming in. Jonah and Rebecca stayed at the house in Coronado while Jonah was at the hospital during that time period. Now I'm going to slow down because this is what happened to. That's why Adam is here in this court. Because on July 11, 2011, Adam finds out from his father that Max has had a serious accident. And that Adam called Rebecca because they've got to know each other over the previous 18 months when Rebecca and Jonah were dating each other. And so Adam called up Rebecca. The evidence shows he got a hold of her, I think, shortly in the afternoon on the 11th, and basically said he was trying to decide what to do. Because on the one hand, he wanted to come here to San Diego to show support to his brother, but he didn't want to be in people's way. He's kind of like that. And he didn't want to be in people's way. And Rebecca, was very nice and said, follow your heart. But Rebecca was kind of encouraging, and I think Adam appreciated the fact that she was encouraging, and Adam made a decision that he was coming to San Diego to show support for his brother during this time of tragedy. Now, how well did Adam and Rebecca know each other at that time? Here's what the facts are. Adam and Rebecca had met each other probably about 20 months earlier. Jonah had started dating Rebecca. The CACT3 family would have 3 or 4 outings a year, usually several outings a year. And Adam would show up at some of those outings when he could get off. Adam had a strange work schedule. When you work in that Mississippi River, you work on the boat for 28 days, then you get off 28 days. So sometimes, but Adam made a lot of family events, and he and Rebecca, they got to know each other. They chatted, they were friendly. There's no evidence of any dislike, animosity. Adam respected and liked Rebecca, and she respected and liked Adam. And that's the evidence, that's the truth. And then all of a sudden we're on July 11th, and Adam made a reservation and he flew to San Diego. He lands here in the afternoon, and Rebecca, to her credit, she insisted she'd pick Max up at the airport. to pick Adam up at the airport so she could take him where Jonah was. They met at the airport. Little did Adam know that when he got off that plane, he was starting what it turned out to be a 7-year nightmare of what's happened to his life. But that's what happens to people. It just happens. He went to the hospital. Jonah was there. Jonah, Rebecca, and Adam went out and had a quiet dinner that night. It was very sad. Then Rebecca and Adam dropped Jonah back off at the hospital, and then Rebecca and Adam drove home to the Coronado residence. And you heard from the evidence. The evidence is established that over the years, when Adam would visit Jonah at his Coronado residence, Adam always stayed in the guest house. The guest house was a separate building, separate from the main residence, in the back of the courtyard, and it's a nice place. And Adam always stayed in the guest house. So when he and Rebecca got to the residence that night, it was about 7:30, 8 o'clock at night, and just the two of them, they'd driven from the hospital. Rebecca and Adam got out of the car. They said that, I used this chart during Adam's testimony. Adam went one way into the guest house. They said goodnight to each other, and Rebecca went into the main residence. And Adam testified, and there's not a single speck of evidence to contradict him, that he went into that guest house, and he stayed there the rest of the evening. He made some phone calls. He was on a 2-hour time difference because he's on Central Time, and so he said he was tired. It's been a pretty stressful day. So he's in bed by roughly 9:30, which would be 11 or 11:30 his time, and he went to bed. Now, another important event that took place on July 12th, I have on my timeline, is that Jonah went back to the hospital after Rebecca and Adam dropped her off, and they left, and Jonah was at the hospital with Max, and Dina was there with him. And the evidence is, and Jonah described this during the course of his trial testimony, that around 10 o'clock at night or so, there was a doctor by the name of Dr. Brad Peterson. It was one of Max's doctors, and Jonah and Dina both testified to this. There's no disagreement about it. They testified they had a very candid, forthright discussion with Dr. Peterson about Max's chances in future. And that at that time, Dr. Peterson, according to both Dina and Jonah, was somewhat blunt, you could say, but candid would be another way to look at it, and told him, look, his brain did not get oxygen for 25 or 30 minutes. And so the outlook is not good. If he does live, he will never walk or talk again. So it was a sobering, very sad conversation that occurred that night. Jonah stayed at the hospital, and he was staying at this place called the Ronald McDonald House, which is a place that right next to the hospital where folks can stay when they have kids in the hospital. So Jonah went over around 12:30 or so to the Ronald McDonald House to go to bed, confirm and prove that Jonah called Rebecca. She did not answer the phone. He left her a voicemail message in which he basically gave her the news, the sad news that Dr. Peterson had provided about the very difficult prognosis about Max not being able to walk or talk, etc. Jonah never received a return phone call from Rebecca that night. So now I'm going to turn and focus on Rebecca and her tragic death that occurs at this time.
Before we get there, is this a good time for
Yes,
a mid-afternoon
yes.
break? We'll go ahead and take our mid-afternoon break now. Please return here at 3:15.